there was a lot of marrying cousins. Was that common? I mean, what was the outcome of, like, children and stuff? Were they close cousins?
Often they were not close cousins. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which marriage, again, was perceived to be an economic institution. One of the ways in which marriage was actually used was to consolidate family fortunes. And the way in which you actually maintained a family fortune rather than dispersed it is you made sure you married people who had some relation to you.
Well, Mr. Collins was going to inherit because there was only girls, so was that why?
That's why Mrs. Bennet is so intent on Elizabeth marrying Mr. Collins.
The first Mr. Collins was.
He's
hysterical.
They're both great for very different reasons, and it's a great character to play. And even in the novel, it's just so well written, how buffoonish and absurd he is. But that sort of situation in which the estate is entailed, which means that it only goes to men, to the son, which is why Mr. Bennet is so intent on having a son. But there's a very long English history to that that's called primogeniture, that basically puts everything on the firstborn, the eldest son. Property passes down through that line. Everyone else doesn't matter. That's the individual that really matters. So when you have 5 daughters and you have an estate that's entailed, that means you only get the income until the man who that estate is associated with is alive. You have a lot of problems, and that's where marriage comes in. You try to get the manipulation where Jane was, and in reality, that person, Elizabeth Bennet, would have been expected to provide for her family by making that match, by making that union.
I think it's really telling too that marriage wasn't for love when Elizabeth goes to visit Mr. Collins and his wife, and in the movie at least, she says that she encourages him to work in his garden.
Yeah, very much so.
To take long walks.
Very much so.
There's days that we don't even speak.
That's right. And she has her room. She has that room. That's her room. And that's the way in which it's described in the novel. That does not prevent Charlotte from being very, very strategic and tactical. There's a number of different moments, right, when she finds out that Elizabeth and Darcy are going to be matched. She makes sure that her husband picks Darcy, right? Because Darcy is the one who's going to have the better fortune, the better career. Charlotte actually is reported to be one of the first people to realize, maybe even before Elizabeth herself, that Darcy is in love with her. She sees that right away. And there's a lot of strategy in that. So, Charlotte, as lovable as she is, as Elizabeth's one example of that. The letters are another example. They redacted a lot of things. That's led to a kind of speculation about her life, as I mentioned. But really what that is, again, a kind of British orientation, I think, towards Jane Austen. They had a sense of her as a family member. So there wasn't this idea of a writer of genius in the way that we think of her now, and in the way in which many people could have thought of her in the early 19th century. Now, in terms of the financial arrangements, I don't actually know. I would suspect that they could have. But a lot of the popularity that we think of now as Jane Austen didn't even happen until the 20th century, really. Right. It wasn't until the 20th... There's a technique, and maybe some of you have heard about it before if you've read a lot of Austen's works and read about her. There's a technique called free and direct discourse that she's often thought of as perfecting. And it's a technique that actually uses the narrator's voice to assert opinions that are actually associated with specific characters. This happens throughout Pride and Prejudice. And it's why we think of as Elizabeth as the narrator of Pride and Prejudice. She's not. It's a third-person omniscient narrator. But the narrator aligns herself, I think it's fair to say that, with Elizabeth quite often. So we think of Elizabeth as very prominent, and she is. But we think of all of the opinions of the novel as being Elizabeth's opinions. They're not all the time. This, for example, is a technique that academics didn't even really start thinking about and identifying until the 20th century. People throughout the 19th century didn't have any idea that she was even working in this technique at all. So that gives you some sense of just how recent a lot of her literary fame, quote-unquote, however you might think of it, how recent it really is. She was a very popular author in the 19th century. I mean, I don't want you to get the sense that nobody had ever read her. She's a very popular author. She wasn't thought about as this author of real genius and innovation, as she is now.
My daughter, we were watching the Masterpiece Theater, all of the movies, and my daughter noticed that there's like a scandal in every story.
Yeah. I mean, I think... I think there is. I think that a lot of that has to do with the way in which Austen was actually trying to assert a kind of independence for her female characters. One of the things I find to be very interesting is Lydia might be actually what we think of as the modern version of love. I ask this question to my students all the time. She does what we would think, right? If you love someone, you do whatever you can to be with them. This is our narrative, right? So she loves. Roundly chastised throughout the entire novel. But that's a scandal that we might actually be able to identify with. So you're right, and then the question becomes, yeah, right, exactly. Don't try this at home. But that's, you always have to ask a question as a reader, how do we value this? And it's not clear how Austen would have valued these things, which is what makes her work so eminently interpretable.
Did she precede the Brontes?
Yes.
And it's interesting that Austen and the Brontes, I don't know if men read the stories also, but it just seems like some of the greatest writing of the early 19th century for the Brontes and for Jane Austen. It's just amazing that when we think of great authors, British authors, that the Brontes and Austen are really right at the top.
Yeah, and it says a lot about the novel. The novel was this is being revised a lot, but the novel was a form that was considered to be a very masculine form, this is to overgeneralize, but a very masculine form early in the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, it's often seen, it's often denigrated actually, as a genre written by women for other women. The way in which it actually loses literary value is the way in which it actually gets associated with sort of frivolous female readers. In the early 19th century, that changes yet again, as you get sort of 19th century women authors who are writing works that are considered to have literary significance. But at the moment that Austen's writing, she's right on the cusp of that. Authors that she identifies with are authors like Gothic authors, for example, that are often considered to be, sort of very marginal in the literary scene. I mean, these novels, which we think of now as the height of literary work, were, sort of these marginal products that, things were pulp that nobody was interested in at all. And now every year, Nobel Prize winners are a novelist.
Did they try to disguise their first names, or try to not to put them in? Or
all of Austen's works were published anonymously, so her name wasn't on any of the title pages.
Right.
But that was not necessarily that uncommon, even into the 19th century. That was a very conventional thing.
James could be here all night.
I could be, and I don't want to do that. Thank you. Come on over.
Of course,
Come on over.
Got our interest. Don't forget, next week we're having our book discussion on persuasion. Come whether you've read it or not, but really this whet my appetite a lot more. Also, we have some handouts here of things that are going on at the library, the Friends newsletter, James's handout if you didn't get it, and nice handout, and there's something else. Oh, of course, that they're offering, and our Thursday morning monthly programs also that we put on here at the library. And there is one this week, is that correct, Elaine?
Yes.
There's one this week.
Yes.
So this is a one-time. This is one time for James, and next week we're doing, I know, that's what
Thank you, very kind.
Of course.
I figured by now everybody
Thank you very much. No!
Thank you all very much.